Why does the Catholic Church have so much rigid structure when it should be a spiritual reality? So this is a very good question, and I think that it needs to be dealt with and answered because it kind of gets to the heart of what does it mean to be a community of believers. Now, there was a guy, Rudolf Sohm, he died about 200 years ago. He talked about this idea that the church was supposed to be a community of charism, that it's all about how God has given us gifts. And he said that any sort of juridical structure would be foreign to the Gospels. However, almost immediately after he said this, he was corrected by both Catholics and by Protestants. And the reason for this is the church isn't just spiritual. It is spiritual, don't get me wrong, it is spiritual. But it also is lived in history. Christ didn't come as an angel. He didn't come as a disembodied spirit. He came as a man. He came as a corporeal being. He lived in the earth. For 30 years, he lived in silence, lived in the silent years, in the quiet, the hidden years. He lived as one of us. When he is founding the church, he doesn't just tell everyone to sort of go do whatever they feel like. He doesn't go and say, just live out your spiritual freedom. He sets up apostles. He chooses apostles. He sends out the 72 disciples. When he founded the church, he said, "You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church." When there was problems that would arise later on in the church, Christ said, first, go as an individual to the person you have a problem with. Then bring witnesses. If they do not listen to the witnesses, bring them to the church. Christ establishes a corporeal being. He establishes a juridic being because he also recognizes that we are people. And so there has to be a sort of historical, there has to be a sort of juridic relationship. Push this even further. We see as soon as Christ ascends into heaven, one of the first acts that the apostles do after Pentecost is they replace Judas. Peter cites two passages in scriptures saying that let him be removed from his office and let another take his place. At least in the mind of Peter, it's very clear that when he was looking at the apostles, they saw it as an office, as a responsibility, that they actually had a sort of station within the church. Push it further. St. Paul, after his conversion, after he's begun preaching, he then goes to Peter and proclaims out the gospel to him for him to approve it, to ensure that he is preaching well. When the church was confronted with a difficult decision of, do Christians still need to follow Mosaic laws or not? Well, we see in Acts chapter 15, the apostles and those that were the heads of the church were brought together into what's called the Council of Jerusalem. They then made a decision for all believers. We see those with positions of authority, those apostles, making a decision for everyone. Even after this, we see St. Paul in his letter, first letter to Timothy, and then also in his letter to Titus, talk about them being ordained, them being put into a position of authority, and then in the case of Titus, to go out and appoint presbyters, which, by the way, priests are called the presbyteroi, the elders. And so he's going out and founding priests. And then you can continue going on throughout the centuries that there is a structure, there is a juridic structure to the church, even from the very beginning. You can see this with the bishops, you can see this with the early church fathers who spoke about the various authorities within the church. You can, if you read Eusebius's history, you can see how there's a sort of juridic aspect to this. But I say all this to get to the core of this. We aren't just living a spiritual anarchy. We aren't just living as a soul without a body as a church. We are brought together, united as a community. And actually, if I might go a little bit more philosophical here, there's an old Latin phrase that wherever there is people, there are laws. Ubi personae sunt, ibi leges sunt. Where there is people, there is laws. Because no matter what happens, if there is two people, there's going to be disagreements, there's going to be conflicts. And so you need laws to ensure justice. Like this church has the Code of Canon Law. It's a big fat book. And it might seem somewhat odd for there to be all of these laws, but these laws are there to ensure that justice is done, that people's rights are respected, and then what to do when someone isn't respecting another's rights, what to do in difficult situations, who gets to make a decision, things like this. All of these things are eminently practical, and we do them all the time in our own personal lives. Well, the church, as being a spiritual being lived in the world, has these things as well. So all this to say, I'm very much so against this idea of spiritual chaos and that Christianity is just a spiritual thing, because it goes against our lived experience, it goes against what Christ founded, and it goes against the history of the church, that always our faith is lived out in the world. And if it is lived out in the world, we're going to need strictures, we're going to need ordinances and precepts, we're going to need instructions on how to go about these difficult things in order for the church to live in the world. Long story short, again, summarizing my summary, we live in embodied faith, and as such, we must have strictures. We are both soul and body, and so to the church, a spiritual reality that's lived in the world.